Greetings to everyone joining us today for our fifth event of the year as the Virginia Worker. This is just one among many events to come, and we hope you will continue to join us as we host guest speakers presenting on a range of topics, covering the history of the Virginia working class and other relevant topics for Virginia workers. Our goal as the Virginia Worker team is to build a distinctly pro-worker and independent ideological pole of attraction for the Virginia working class, which otherwise does not exist. We're comprised of groups across the state who emphasize organizing workers independently from capitalist parties and their auxiliary organizations, which promote a class collaborationist agenda to the detriment of Virginia workers. Our website is meant to popularize the struggles, campaigns, reports, and debate across the state affecting Virginia workers. We welcome all contributions from Virginia workers that fall in line with our mission statement, which you can find at thevirginiaworker.com. Now on to tonight's presenters. We have Angry Workers with us today who are going to be presenting on their book, Class Power in 0 Hours. They're a small political collective who've been organizing for more than 6 years in London's industrial backyard, mainly in the food manufacturing and logistics sector. This book is about their experiences as they try and find new ways of building class power in tough times. It is essential reading for anyone who's grappling with the question, what's next for the working class politics and revolutionary strategy? You can find more information at their website with updates at angryworkers.org. So I'm gonna pass it along to y'all with the Angry Workers. Right before I do so, we're gonna let them present, and then anybody who has questions, we ask that you type them in the chat and we'll read them off to them, and that's how it's gonna go for tonight. All right, without further ado, Angry Workers.
Nice one. Thank you for having us. This is Kieran.
Hi.
And I'm Marco. And
maybe just a disclaimer at the beginning, like we've been up for about, I don't know, 12, 60, 18 hours or something. We've just finished a 12.5-hour shift at the hospital. So if we start rambling or like go a bit off track, then it's basically because
we're tired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do you want to start on the book?
Yeah. So this is our book, which we published about 2 years ago now. And it was published just at the start of the first lockdown. So it was written kind of before the pandemic hit, but then it became kind of quite, it was quite prescient because, you know, we were talking about like essential workers and, you know, their kind of role in society currently, and the kind of potential for those workers to kind of organize and build class power, and kind of what's the kind of relationship between them and a kind of new society. So for those of you that don't know anything about the book, it's basically a kind of documentation of the 6 or 7 years that we spent in this kind of one area of very far West London, where we were working mainly in warehouses. We were very interested in kind of logistics at the time. But actually, before we moved there, we didn't really know like that it was like how much food was a kind of major industry in that area. So then it turns out that quite a lot of the jobs that we ended up doing was, you know, kind of related to food. So like Marco works as a Tesco delivery driver, which is a big like supermarket chain, in this warehouse with like what 1,400 workers. I was working in a food factory that supplied that supermarket and all of the supermarkets in UK, and that was about 4,000 workers. So yeah, we kind of talk about our organizing experiences, let's say, but the general kind of motivation wasn't about organizing so much as like as a kind of political group who want to, you know, destroy capitalism and live in a kind of communist society. Like what kind of politics do we actually need to do? Like how do we get there? And it was a kind of an experiment of like what kind of political strategy would be necessary, what kind of political action would be necessary, like how do those two things fit together? So we kind of went there with the idea of like, oh, we're interested in logistics as a kind of site of struggle. And at that time, there was a big kind of struggle of warehouse workers, like in US. There was, you know, the Walmart workers were doing stuff, and then a big inspiration to us was these warehouse workers in Italy, and they were mainly migrant workers and had managed to kind of win, like, you know, massive concessions from the bosses, and they were in a very precarious, like, immigration position. And so we were like, oh, you know, these were these new kind of sites of work where there were thousands of people working under the same roof, which hadn't kind of happened in like a long time, let's say, because like over the last kind of 20-30 years, like there's more of a dispersal of production. So like there's this kind of potential there of all of these workers, and especially within kind of global kind of capitalist production, this kind of area of like distribution and supply chains, you know, became, you know, more and more important. And so, you know, we kind of had the privilege, I guess, of choosing where to orient ourselves. And so we decided on this part of town because there were a lot of warehouses. It was largely a migrant kind of working class neighborhood. But we kind of didn't know too much, you know. So it was a bit of a, yeah, kind of like learning of like actually what's going on. And at the time as well, you know, Brexit was going to happen. There's a lot of talk about the expansion of the low wage sector. There was a lot of talk about immigration, you know, kind of nationalist sentiments, you know, and there was a lot of people on the left kind of always have a lot of things to say about these things. Automation is another one, but actually like what is going on the ground. And I think this was like a really good place to like find out all of that stuff. And so our kind of political approach is like a kind of inquiry method, and that kind of in summary means that we don't necessarily have a kind of fixed strategy of how to organize. It's more like a bit of research, like what is going on, how is the production process organized, how are these companies organized in relation to each other, what kind of workers work there, how are they related to workers like in kind of other workplaces, either in the UK or abroad, and using that as then the basis for thinking about how to kind of build some kind of class power on the shop floor. I feel like I'm rambling a bit.
No, that's all right. Yeah, no, I think the political background was that we have to start from scratch. I mean, the left is largely detached from working class reality. We ourselves thought that, you know, it's a process where workers themselves analyze how the exploitation is organized, how the state colludes in that with the migration laws, and how, let's say, local middle class people collude in it as landlords, all these kind of things. We thought we, as militants, we can analyze, and that itself is a political process. Once workers start analyzing why their situation is like it is, and try to analyze where their, you know, little steps of taking power is, that's a political process. And I think the left largely puts that into an economic box and say, okay, the unions are responsible for that, and politics happens somewhere else. And we basically wanted to question that. So we built a solidarity network, which is like basically, you know, centered around the main industrial areas, to say, if you've got problems in or outside of work, you know, we help each other. There's a direct like link and aid. We try to link that solidarity network to workplace groups. We had like independent newspapers, factory newsletters, In some situations, we joined existing unions as reps. In other situations, when it was not, beneficial, we tried to self-organize. When we were in the mainstream unions, we always kept our independence. So we had independent newsletters, and our line with the workers was always like, we can push the unions, for example, to call for a general assembly in these 4 factories. If the union is not doing it, then we have to do it ourselves. So always like seeing that, how far can you push self-organization within the union framework, but also preparing workers that at some point these unions will shut down this space. And we have to use this space now to basically build our independence. We had a newspaper where we actually tried to develop a new political language. It was basically workplace reports, reports from the Solidarity Network, but also something that we called a system series, where we took up the fact that since 2008, a lot of workers try to understand what's happening globally. I mean, they talk about the financial crisis, how does it all link up, a lot of conspiracy theories from YouTube. And we were just trying to relate to that, what is the system? And basically try to popularize the Communist Manifesto. And I mean, you can read them there online. It's like basically an attempt to say a bit historically, where's the system coming from, and what is our power to change it as workers. So experiences,
so the book it covers quite a lot of ground, so it talks about the geographical area and kind of historically what went on there, why these workplaces developed, what kind of strategic role this kind of area has in like the bigger kind of economy in the UK, and how it's linked to kind of global supply chains and all of that. It talks about actual organising experiences on the job, and it goes into quite a lot of detail, 3 in particular. What we try to do, we try and sketch out the situation that we were confronted with, and the choices that we made, and we really try to be kind of honest and like self-critical, because we're not professional organizers or something, we're just, we consider ourselves as militants in the sense that like our motivation for getting certain jobs is like a political one, but what was I saying?
Organizers.
Oh yeah, so we try and talk about those experiences from like a perspective of being a militant in a workplace and trying things, and not having a kind of, which I think is maybe quite common at the moment, that you have this like kind of organizer's manual and you have to like do this and this, and you do this stress test and like blah blah blah, and then you'll like get results, and if you don't, then that just means you weren't good enough, you weren't like a good enough organizer. Like I think at some point workers need to take control of their own struggle, and that has a kind of dynamic of its own and all of that. And so this idea of like the professional organizer, I just think it's a bit odd, but maybe we can like have a discussion about that later on. But anyway, so it goes into quite a lot of detail about these like organizing experiences and what worked and what didn't work so well, which hopefully might be kind of useful to other people. And also we would like encourage people to do that, regardless, because it's all like a learning experience. There's so much kind of propaganda out there about like good success stories, but like what do you actually learn as a class? And I think we still have to like learn quite a lot of stuff. So there's that kind of element. We also kind of interview some women workers who were kind of friends, work colleagues, about their work and life experiences, and that covers quite a lot of stuff around working in lots of different countries, those kind of work experiences, friendships, relationships, kind of family life, aspirations, quite a good kind of snapshot of like some political ideas behind it were. And like one of them, to kind of briefly say, was just to kind of break this kind of material dependence that a lot of the young kind of newer migrants had on the more established migrant community. And yeah, there was a lot of kind of intra-community, let's say, exploitation, and we wanted to kind of break that with the Solidarity Network. So we talk about that, we talk about the newspaper, and then at the end we kind of, it's a bit more of a political, if you like, kind of political chapters.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like a bigger segment about food production historically and currently, and the idea behind that is that somehow workers have to develop, let's say, a counter knowledge about how we produce things and the contradictory way that we produce things. Because in the end, it's not just a struggle, let's say, a self-defense or better wages and all that. It's in the end, we prepare ourselves to take over the means of production. So with each inquiry, whatever it might be now held, for us at the time it was food, is like to understand, you know, on one hand, you can say the vastness of capitalist organization of something like food. And historically that was like, you know, capitalism was mainly an agrarian revolution, making food production more, you know, enormously more productive, but, you know, in a fucked up way as well. So we look at that and see, like, you know, we're not saying, oh, we have to all go back to our own little gardens. I mean, there is something to say about like a global food system and an industrial food system, but like, what does that actually mean? And I think the left has very little effort or revolutionaries into actually looking at productive knowledge. So we try that in, you know, in a very sketchy way, but we see that as part of the inquiry. And there's, I think the conclusions would be for us, like people ask, like, yeah, but, you know, what do you say after the 6 years? I mean, we have to say at the time, there were not many strikes in general. It was really under Brexit. Most people felt like there's this big blanket on their heads. They don't know, you know, will they stay in the country or not? So there was very little of actual strikes, and we talk about an area of, you know, 100,000 workers around, you know, Heathrow Airport and all the logistics, 100,000 workers on minimum wages and very few strikes. So what we were able to do is obviously limit by that, but you can say that we was 2, 3, 4 people who started the project, you know, after we got contacts in, let's say, 40, 50 bigger workplaces. So we had our ear out. We were somehow like prepared. We had like 20, 30 working class people in the area who became friends. We had like political discussions with some of us, you know, some of these workers went to international Amazon meetings because they started working at Amazon. There was some, I would say, a political process, at least, of, you know, exchanging, you know, ideas, experiences of struggle. So with, let's say, very limited resources, we had no backing. We just had us and the wages, so to speak. We managed to kind of build a little base within that time frame, I would say. Yeah, that's a book. As Kieran said, the last part is a bit about, you know, why we're not joining the, you know, Labour Party, a criticism of, you know, democratic socialism, just a few points.
There's a critique of syndicalism as well. Chapter.
Yeah, there's a critique of syndicalism, although we feel like a lot of affinity to something like the early IWW. At the same time, we see problems once people think the power is in the organization and not by workers themselves, and then they always have to promote their own organization and they can't criticize their own struggles anymore because that would undermine the organization. So these are kind of things that we saw in exchange with a lot of syndicalist comrades who we really respect, from Poland to Italy, but there we see certain like traps. And it's a small, like, how can we call it, like a little vision of what would it mean, like a regional insurrection and taking over means of production in a global system, you know, showing that it will be hard to imagine it as a regional kind of effort, but at the same time we try just like thinking about what's a period of transition. What could that look like?
And I think like some people thought that that was a bit odd, like that we'd written that. And I remember reading one book review online, which I think it was on Goodreads. Anyway, you should never read your own reviews. But like she just couldn't get the idea that we would kind of write something like, you know, what a kind of vision of what a revolutionary transition might look like and how we might how that might look like. It just seemed like audacious to her, you know, like I think she just kind of expected a book on organizing, and then so why are they talking about like revolution? And I think that kind of says a lot about a lot of kind of lefties, I guess. I mean, with this kind of separation between like what you do day to day and like actually what you want to achieve, like this idea of like political strategy and like what your day-to-day political work is, seems like, you know, quite far removed. And even like kind of bringing those two things together in a book, I don't know, seems
I mean, there is, to be honest, there's a big gulf between what we were doing in West London and this idea of a revolutionary transition. I mean,
well, yeah, but I mean, to say that's like an illusion of grandeur, I mean, you could say that, but at the same time, like, I think it's important to like know why you're doing what you're doing, you know. And I think our kind of focus on like essential work and bigger workplaces and the idea of like, how do you have a political process that makes people feel confident and like feel able to feel like they can take over the running of society and stuff. I mean, that's the kind of crux of it, isn't it? That's kind of what we try and do in a kind of small way. But yeah, so
yeah, and maybe to give like two examples, more recent examples after we finished the book, where the relation between having roots inside the class, but at the same time like strategic thinking, which for us is somehow connected to a lot of the 1960s, 70s Italian discussion about like class composition. We can go into detail what that means. Like, to just give two examples, I mean, one was like during the first lockdown of the pandemic, we did a lot of interviews with workers, tube drivers, like train drivers, midwives, people who are working at the airport and so on. And on one hand, we saw like, you know, on a very minute embryonic level, there was some kind of phase of workers' control during the first weeks, where people really asked the question, like, is what we're doing actually essential, or is it risking our lives for some bullshit? I was a delivery driver. My colleagues would ask themselves, should we really kind of deliver like some bottles of champagne for the financial office in town center? Why would we do that when the pandemic started? Whereas if we deliver it to the local nursery, that might make sense. So there was like all of a sudden a discussion about, you know, what is actually social useful work, the politicization of that kind of concept. At the same time, there were attacks on workers in UK, was called fire and rehire. People were like confronted, either you lose a job or you sign worse conditions contracts. And at the airport, Heathrow, where we had some roots over the years, we could see how the union is not using, let's say, the class strengths that they would have in order to, let's say, enforce things against the bosses, because you had cargo section, that's now a bit of a detail, but like they were working overtime. My ex-colleagues were working overtime on the airfields to unload Chinese machines with PPE, whereas the tourism sector of the airport was like down. And the union, although it's the same union in the same workplace, signed an okay contract for the cargo, and, you know, didn't use that power that they had at that moment to defend workers in passengers tourism. And I think to have a political debate, to say like, okay, in this pandemic, all of a sudden the question is, why are supermarket shelves empty? Who's doing essential work? What are the conditions of these delivery drivers and these food workers and everyone? So all of a sudden you've got a debate about, why 3/4 of our work in this society is basically bullshit. And, at the same time, you're under attack and the unions are not even able to just defend you on the union level. I think that opens some cracks. And yeah, I think that was a confirmation why it was useful to stay in the area, to build context, but also to have this kind of political debate at the same time, to be able to see these kind of contradictions there. And I think that's even more pronounced on the US context. If you see that within a year, you had like 3 main elements of working class struggle, basically not coming together, but like happening semi-parallel or like in a very short span of time. One is like, you can say the re-emergence of strikes in manufacturing, warehouses and so on, with Striketober and, Kellogg's and, John Deere and whoever went on strike, new generation somehow, often people who didn't go on strike before. So you've got like the productive collective element of the working class. You had like an emergence of, let's say, intellectual technical workers, often from some kind of humanist point of view, Google workers, being critical, well-paid technical workers, critical of the product. They don't want to use the product for surveillance. Medical, scientists who are critical of the government, how they do the pandemic. Even someone like Snowden was like, you see cracks within this kind of intelligentsia. And then you had the proletarian violence as a reaction against state violence with George Floyd. So these 3 elements, which would have to come together in an upheaval, like productive knowledge, a collectivity, the question of violence, but there's no organization. And what are the actual tendencies that could link these kind of segments of the class? For that, you need some understanding of, the inner tendencies and organization, our organization. And I think we need reflections on that. And people get bogged down too quickly in, we have to build the program, build the organization, and not really looking what is already happening there on the class level. So I think we leave it here, maybe for the moment, and then hopefully you've got some questions. That would be great. Was that somehow all right?
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's a good overview. We can go ahead and open it up to discussions. Again, if folks have questions, please submit it in the chat and I'll read them off as they come along. So maybe we can give some folks a minute here to start their typing.
Just weird, someone came from Scotland.
Yeah, it seemed like there was a pretty good following of folks in the UK around this event. So glad we can make it international. So, where do you think the working class is now since the pandemic? Like, do you think it's in a stronger point? And how does that relate to the left?
I've probably got a more optimistic view than me, where the working class is at the moment.
Well, on one hand, you've got the great resignation. You've got a labor shortage in certain sectors. At the same time, you've got job cuts in others. And at least in the UK, there was no, let's say there were probably 20, 30, 40 disputes about fire and rehire, about, attacking jobs and wages. But none of these disputes really became, took a step into an offensive, for example, by factory occupation or really a militant action, and could become a focus, And in Italy, we've seen something like that. We had GKN, which is a manufacturer mainly for aviation and car industry. And they're a British-based company in Birmingham here. They closed the factory, or they wanted to close the factory. And the union said, oh, it's British quality. We shouldn't give up these jobs. They're British quality jobs, blah, blah. Very defensive, mainly kind of appealing to politicians. Whereas in Italy, GKN workers, they occupied the factory. They went out and actually visited all the other factories where people were also affected by job cuts, and tried to say this is a class, kind of a wider class issue. So, you know, why is it not happening in the UK? You know, historical reasons. Also, like really, you know, a focus of the trade unions on the state as, you know, someone who you communicate with, you know, partly through the Labour Party, but also in general, like historically, I think the unions here were always more like, you know, focused on their state and hoping that by appealing, you know, British Airways shouldn't betray Britain, blah, blah, you know. So on one hand, I think there was a political debate, like very vast debate about, like, you know, how is the society organized? What about the global dimension of, you know, production, supply chain crunch? Why is stuff not coming from China? You know, our hospital had no wet wipes, so we couldn't do our essential work of washing people because the wet wipes come from China. So people are really, like, nowadays confronted with the global dimension of their life. But for workers to find a response would mean that you actually build relationships with these workers in China or with the supply workers. And that seems more difficult nowadays to, you know, to have a productive cohesion than you had when you had, I don't know, the councils in 1920, where, you know, workers were living in a company town, in a factory town, close relationships, people could communicate, and you have a vision of socialism as self, you know, like workers' control. To imagine that on a, you know, on a global level between Silicon Valley and Shenzhen is a hard one. So, but people are confronted that that's a task for us if we want to survive. That's a task.
I know, but I still think, like, the general mood is pretty much like there's nothing we can do. I think that, I mean, that's not to say there haven't been pockets of, like, industrial action, and with quite big pay increases. So, for example, in Scotland at DHL, quite recently, they won like a 13% pay increase. Within food, you know, like the meat workers, like male, what do they call, butchers from Poland, you know, they can, like, get a 15% pay rise or whatever. But it's very kind of, you know, there are these kind of small pockets of workers that kind of use their leverage, and I'd say most of them are kind of like male workers generally. There's a bit of a generalization, but I'd say men who are kind of maybe drivers, like transport workers. They're kind of like, they've got a bit of maybe still kind of remember a culture of some kind of collectivity and militancy, but like also bin men, for example, you know, but that doesn't necessarily, like, translate into to, like, other groups of workers. And I don't really see the unions that are behind those disputes kind of, you know, doing that either. You know, like, it's enough just to, like, have a success and put your propaganda out on social media and, like, oh, the unions are doing a good job, which they kind of have to. I mean, they need to have some kind of flagship campaigns to remain relevant. But in terms of a generalization of those struggles, I think it's I don't really see it happening at the moment.
Thanks for that. Mike asks that you mentioned in passing the issue of professional organizers. The nonprofit sector here has exploded. How does that compare to the UK, and how does that impact organizing there?
I think it's definitely gaining more traction. These kind of smaller base unions like IWGB and UVW and whatever, I mean, they're getting bigger, and they're having to employ, like, more professional organizers. Also because it's just, like, so much work to do that, to get a kind of dispute off the ground is, like, so difficult. You know, doing that without a kind of full time, that might seem a bit, like, impossible. But yeah, I mean, obviously that kind of comes with its own problems. But I mean, some of the criticism that we had, like about our book, was like along the same lines of like, oh, call yourself organizers, you were shit. And it's like, well, no, we don't call ourselves organizers, but like, you know, if you're working in a workplace and you have to like try your best to like do something, and we did do the IWW training, and we, you know, we're not like we're going to put workers in a kind of dangerous position where they're going to get sacked or something. Like, we take our chances, but we know that nothing is like spontaneous.
Sometimes.
Yeah, but then, you know, also historically, if you look at strikes, there's always like some communist in the background who's like, you know, doing some donkey work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I kind of think a lot of the stuff around organizing is about this, has become like a lot more professionalized.
Yeah, you can really see like a lot of the organizers also, like I know a bit more about like German kind of background where there's well financed through the Left Party, like, or Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. These are often people who have got like, you know, some degrees, university degrees, and then they become organizers of workers. And you can say like in some situations that's actually worked out fine, like the big 2 hospital strikes recently, like about 2, 3, 4 months ago in Berlin. They were possible because there were 40, 50 organizers from the union going, you know, from ward to ward, talking to people and things. But the problem is what happens once the union stops financing these kind of organizers. You know, are there actually structures like you had here, like shop stewards, local reps, who take up this work, you know, or is the structure, you know, collapsing as soon as the organizers are pulled out? Yeah, but in general, yeah, there are a lot of jobs to be had as well. You know, you could see with like Labour Party, you know, with that, like all the think tanks, you know, any kind of lefty could get a kind of, you know, a job. You know, we could see that doing Syriza when in Greece. You know, it was really like professionalization of the movement, where a lot of people like, yeah, why not? You know, I'm an activist, so why not being paid for it? You know, I become like a tenant organizer, I become a labor journalist, I become this and that. But you can really see like everyone is just leeching off the workers. Everyone needs their workers to promote themselves as like someone who deserves being paid for, you know, something that is a privilege, as being an organizer. So it really makes it difficult also on a comradeship level. If you're never really sure, like, you know, what's your interest now? Are you here now as a paid journalist, or are you a comrade, or, you know? So we had a lot of, you know, kind of bad experiences with that, where, I don't know, you're just not sure, like, you know, on what level are you dealing with each other. Some people do it fine. You know, I know academics, they do good research. They say, I'm an academic, you know, here I am, but I'm interested in workers and I'm going to write you know, something that might be interesting for you. Fair enough. You know, it's a clear relationship. But, you know, once it gets all, you know, I find it difficult. It creates a kind of swamp of.
I mean, but it's like kind of saying all of that, I'd say, you know, let's say now we're working in a hospital, let's say, we're like doing, you know, I've done this collective letter on our ward about like understaffing, and like it somehow feels like I am the organizer. But if I wasn't a union rep, I think it would be a bit more difficult to kind of to do that, because everyone would be like, oh, why are you doing that?
Yeah,
and it's just a bit odd.
Especially because of the hierarchy. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, if you were a nurse, it would be different, but you're a housekeeper, and the
Yeah.
hierarchy in the hospital is very harsh. So
I'm like bottom of the pile, so it'd be like, oh, why? It kind of gives you some legitimacy and credibility to kind of do that. So it's not as if, you know, so then we just kind of have to tread that line. It's a bit of a kind of contradiction, I guess, but like, you know, the union is somehow useful to be able to just put yourself out there, and it like, you know, people can kind of say, oh, okay, oh, you're a union rep. Oh, okay, that makes sense then why you're doing that.
Yeah, but even if you do it like outside of the union, for example, I'm like a healthcare assistant in the same hospital. They put us on a so-called apprenticeship contract. You do the normal 12.5-hour shift, you hardly learn anything, you just kind of be pushed in there, but like they get money from the government. We've got over 500 so-called apprentices, so, and the training is nothing and we get the minimum wage. So I went around with one or two others, like, you know, talking to people, and a lot of them, you know, they were up for like, you know, discussing it. So we had a WhatsApp group, 40, 50 people. But as soon as you then write a formal complaint to the company, and even if you're not doing it as a union, you know, then the management will say, okay, we do like an investigation. You know, they send letters, and bit by bit you can see the 40, 50 of them are at the end 10 left who feel confident enough to deal with all this kind of formal language and things. And you know, it can happen even if you do it outside of the union. So you have to build a space where workers can really like learn to, you know, to deal with these situations collectively. But you know, after 12.5-hour shift, you don't just meet. You know, it's really difficult to build these spaces. You know, you can't do it on WhatsApp, you can't even do it on Zoom. I think you have to really like, you know, build some social community of some sort, and that takes time.
Okay, that was a very long-winded answer too.
Oh yeah, that was really
That's great.
long.
No, that's fine. Because you're touching on a lot of things I've experienced, and we hosted Joe Burns like maybe 1 or 2 events ago on his new book, Class Struggle Unionism, and you know, I think he is coming from a similar place that you all are, in that, you know, he does not believe in the professional organizer role, and believes that, you know, it's like the class workers themselves need to be activated and take initiative themselves, rather than you know, like being so fixated on like the you know, No Shortcuts book of like, here's all these organizing techniques as a professional organizer. And like you referenced the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, they host her, and she's been doing these trainings on being a professional organizer, and like all these like little tactics you need to know as a professional organizer. And so I don't know, as someone, I feel like in a similar position as y'all, like don't view myself as a professional organizer, yet at the same time have benefited from going through the organizer trainings and reading through the materials. You know, you referenced earlier talking to folks with labor notes. They're very much so kind of in that milieu of the like professional organizer model. But I think maybe one of the big kickers here is like, we're coming from this, you know, as like Marxist or from a revolutionary perspective. Like if there were to be some sort of professional organization, it would seem like it would need to come from that angle, rather than, you know, just strictly through the trade unions, which are just dominated either by, you know, like liberals or like Labor Party officials or whatever. So yeah, I don't know if you have any further comments on that.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, we've got, I think, on the level of getting together as, you know, a solidarity network or meeting good people at work, you know, I think we're fine on that level. What is always a problem is because there's no real movement where people, you go to like an event together, you know, hey, colleague, you know, there's a talk about this, or like there's a, you know, a film screening on that, or there's a little demonstration on that, you know, there's no organic way of politicization. And then you get into this cringy moment, you know, oh, should we have some self-education? It's like, yeah, like workers sometimes have interest in, you know, just discussing books, or like, you know, having a reading group or something, but it always feels like, you know, to bridge like on a sometimes individual level, you know, the gap between, let's say, us as communists and, let's say, class conscious or militant workers that we need. We didn't have a good model there. You know, maybe we should have formalized more and say like, okay, to be, you know, you can become a member of our collective, but, you know, there are certain things that you should read, you know, but like at the same time, we're a bit like, oh, this is really also like a bit like a not top down. I mean, have no problem with top down really, but like I mean it's no, but it's like, you know, it's like a bit like here's the training program and you have to just go through that. It doesn't feel like an organic process. So we were fumbling a bit, like, you know, we tried to have these kind of social events with a little bit of documentary and discussion on this, like someone would present and talk about, I don't know, the strike in the of tube drivers, or like, I don't know who we had there, some tenant person. So we, you know, you try to recreate the spirit of a movement, but like it's difficult to get then really people involved in the political work. You know, we have like, you know, you need one or two or three people, you know, in 1 or 2 years where you really think, okay, you know, from being co-workers, we become comrades. That's really, you know, something that we are grappling with. That's why we still do like reading groups and things, and people are interested, but they're dispersed.
But I mean, it's also why we kind of become union reps, because it is just somehow like the easiest way to get in touch with like a bit more kind of class conscious workers, you know. I mean, they're still few and far between, but I mean, you've got a bit of a better chance.
And you meet a lot of careerists as well. I would say 80% careerist, 20% solid militants. So you have to bear a lot of bullshit as well, at least in my union. Yeah.
So do you think, you know, you talk about a criticism of democratic socialism and also a criticism of syndicalism. So I mean, I'm not that familiar with the critique of syndicalism, but I would imagine it's something along the lines of there is a need for a political organization to exist outside of the workplace, to be some sort of like a central nervous system to provide guidance, strategy, slogans, program, etc. Is that where y'all are coming from with that, or do you see the need for like some sort of a revolutionary organization as a party, maybe?
Yeah. I don't know. Like,
I mean, I don't think it's a kind of, in our minds, they're not kind of two totally separate things. But at the same time, I mean, in reality, I mean, we were kind of angry workers, a political collective, and then, you know, we would do our kind of workplace stuff. And it was, you know, as Marco said, there was like 1 or 2 workers that then got involved in like the political stuff, but that's very difficult. Somehow there was this separation, but I think ideally there wouldn't be this. It would just be kind of one organization. Like you would have your workplace staff, and workers get interested in discussing kind of the bigger political questions as a direct consequence of the need to in their workplace struggle, because it's inevitable somehow. And will that organization somehow be able to organically develop out of this, you know? But yeah, I mean, that's kind of very difficult. You kind of need at first to like kind of conscious workers who come up against this brick wall and then do want to start kind of discussing politically.
Yeah, and I mean, with the syndicalism, our problems were also, what does it mean, for example, even on a level of workplace struggle, if, for example, all your members decide, and we had the situation in one Amazon warehouse, it was a rank and file union, there are no bureaucrats, it was proper syndicalists, and they're all beloved comrades, but like for some reason, most of their members, because they had higher seniority, they were demanding seniority pay. So as a syndicalist organization, you're a bit like, okay, we are democratic, so our members decide, but at the same time, it's a demand that divides the class. I mean, so at that point, you have to have a political point of view and intervention and say like, no, as an organization, although we are member-led and democratic and whatever, but like we don't support demands that in future or like in, you know, in the medium term undermines class unity. So, but like, how do you know, you can't really justify that on syndicalist terms. You have to justify that on political terms. And the same problem with, syndicalism, often like having a fetish of their own organizational strengths, rather than saying, okay, forms of struggle have to be reevaluated all the time. Self-critical reflection, you hardly ever find. Third level would be currently, we've got good, comrades in France, part of a syndicalist organization, Sud Solidaire. They are leftist, but now in the war in Ukraine, they support like, armament, arms delivered being to Ukraine, meaning the Ukrainian state. So, there you have a political debate, and I think you can't really solve that within the concept of syndicalism. At the same time, you can't have like just one political program and the thing is solved. It's just like, it's even within our group, we had a lot of discussions about, how to relate to the situation in Ukraine, for example. Obviously you could avoid that if you just have like, revolutionary defeatism, question solved or problem solved, and that's that. But like, we're still kind of grappling there. But yeah, at some point you need a position. You can't just kind of continue veering around.
Yeah, on the reference to the Ukraine, I actually was curious. It seems like a lot of tendencies, whether they're anarchist, Maoist, Trotskyist, they're buying into this idea of the Ukraine waging, like a national liberation campaign, right? So then therefore there needs to be some sort of class collaboration between Ukrainian workers and the Ukrainian bourgeoisie backed by NATO. And it just sort of seems like internationally there's like this dominance of like this like a left nationalism essentially over like a class versus class line. So yeah, I guess I was just kind of curious, like, would you agree with that? Do you think like nationalism is predominant amongst the left and how they're interpreting these struggles, or yeah?
Well, I guess at this point, I mean, you probably could follow it a bit on our website, but there are at least two positions within the collective, and one is informed by experiences from the war in Yugoslavia. So where there was an area around the mining town Tuzla, where there was working class resistance against ethnic cleansing, but that overlapped with military organization of the Bosnian state. But still, it was a fairly like a clear signal. We don't want to take part in this kind of ethnic kind of cleansing. We are kind of a multi-ethnic area. We are a working class area. So there was support with that, or solidarity.
And I guess this comrade's criticism would be like, if you have a kind of, hard line position of like no arms and, this is kind of over before it's even begun, then you will never like actually find these pockets, like, there's a lot of flag waving or whatever, but like, how do you see beyond that to like some kind of working class content, which, there might be, but if you've already kind of closed your mind to it, that this is a kind of, the whole thing is a foregone conclusion, then you're not investigating, you're just being dogmatic, So I think this is the kind of one of the major fault lines in kind of our internal angry workers discussion at the moment.
But having, tried to do a bit of investigation, I don't see many indicators that there's a similar working class kind of independent tendency, or even the possibility for that to develop in the current situation. The war is on a different level in terms of like technology. Like in Yugoslavia, maybe you would get along with an AK-47. Now you just need like NATO arms, like heavy tank kind of destroying missiles and all that. And there's no political independent kind of tendency that would say we neither want to be with these oligarchs kind of EU begging kind of nationalists, nor do we want with Russian kind of fucking crude oil, I don't know what fuckers. We just want, like, you know, we have our own territory. I think there's neither subjectively nor objectively that kind of space. So I don't know. That's why.
We're currently fighting that one out.
Yeah, we're still fighting on that. But yeah. Yeah, for us, I mean, the question, we thought we get most of our clues nowadays from the US. Since 2008, most stuff is happening in the US, and it happens earlier compared to the UK. So we were following like organization like Marxist Center and base building, and we thought, okay, that's interesting, you know, a critique of all the, you know, the Occupy generation really thinking, okay, you know, we have to, you know, get our, you know, dig a bit deeper here. But yeah, so for us, it would be interesting to know, is it just a political problem in the sense, oh, they had not enough political clarity and it was too, you know, too many different things in the pot? Or was it actually like this idea of base building is a little bit weird as well sometimes, you know, oh, let's go to the working class people and, you know, let's give them food, or, you know, let's build, you know, it's just like a little bit, you know, a base for what as well. It's just like a bit, you know, but at the same time, we were really interested. So I don't know, do you see like a positive reflection of that crisis? Like, you know, that people sit together and kind of reflect on the 2, 3, 4 years in a positive sense, like, you know, what, or is it just like each political tendency is just like, yeah, these were wrong and these were wrong? I don't know. That's a question to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak as an individual to that. I'm sure you get a lot of different answers depending on who you ask within that project. But I think there was just a lot of eclecticism and like not really coherence in terms of what the direction was. And like you say, base building for what? I think it's like kind of open, like that idea can be utilized by any political tendency. It's not inherently like communist or Marxist. And then it's you know, again, like you're saying, like is it a political project? Is there actual like organizing of workers, or is it just kind of like red charity? And I think there was just kind of it was never fully fleshed out. The debates weren't, there was not well structured debates, I think. And I think there was just sort of this just baseline understanding that we need to go out and organize and we need to build a base, and out of that somehow these things are going to be resolved through the process. And I think that's kind of where it was like kind of on that very simplistic level, I think. So I think because of that, there was no like real, like we had our delegates council and everything, we were supposed to be hashing it out, but there just was a lack of unity, I think, and it was inevitable that it just sort of fell apart. But nonetheless, I think it was like a good learning experience for a lot of folks, and it's a jumping off point, and it's not like it was a wasted effort or anything. And I do think it demonstrated the importance of having a national structure or network in place to help organize and facilitate and build out like regional organizing efforts. You know, like having that some startup cash to jump drive some organizing effort. Like that is very useful. Like you say, when you're just kind of on your own as a few scattered workers, it's very daunting and hard to build everything from scratch, and you have to be really motivated to do it and keep with it. And especially if you have no prior organizing experience, nothing to tap into. And I think that's why so many folks tend to integrate or gravitate towards these nominally national organizations, whether it's Democratic Socialists of America or Party for Socialism and Liberation, or, you know, whatever. Like they just see that, oh, this is a national organization and I should link up with that because I don't know what I'm doing. And then unfortunately, I have to go through like probably years of just endless toil and not getting anywhere, and be like, why am I doing this? And then they just get burnt out and leave.
Yeah,
that's my
yeah. Do you guys think that there's a relationship between, let's say, the experience both of like, you know, George Floyd uprising, but also like the time where the pandemic basically, you know, people had to ask bigger questions, the question of, you know, even if it was just like on a very shit level of, you know, you are heroes, you know, the guys who really still do the work and all that, but like some self-confidence from that, you know, is there a relation between these two elements and, you know, Striketober, like, you know, like a reemergence of, you know, militancy in sectors where you haven't seen it for a while, or is that too far-fetched to think?
I would give more credit for the development of any sort of militancy or working class activity to objective factors of capitalism, like disruption in the supply chains and growing precarity for workers, rising inflation. I would say those had much more of an impact on driving workers to finally be willing to maybe strike when they wouldn't otherwise and want to organize, versus like, and I think George Floyd, you know, played into that as well. But I think for me, the biggest frustration with it was that it's like with every spontaneous development, you know, whatever movement happens to kick off every few years that mobilizes people, unless there's an actual political organization in place to intervene that's built out its mass base, it just inevitably gets recaptured by, you know, the state and liberalism, and it just gets funneled back into the NGOs, and it's like it just gets contained and it goes away. And I know we were talking before this started about just like there was like this high mark in 2020 with the pandemic and George Floyd and a lot of activity, and it seemed like some people thought this was the revolution, right? But then you see, you know, Biden come in and everybody line up behind Biden, and January 6th happens and everybody uses that as like this, thinking that fascism was at the door or something, and it was just a way to further solidify people behind the bourgeois state. And I think it was, for people who are outside of that on the left, like demoralizing in a way. Like, we thought we were at this point, we thought people were more developed in their consciousness and prepared to wage a higher level of struggle, but we didn't have the organization in place. We didn't have a program or a way to really intervene, and we were just kind of tailing the spontaneous development of things. And now it feels like we're kind of back at square one with it. But at the same time, like, the objective conditions, I think, have created a better climate for organizing, especially workers at the point of production, than ever before. So that's the positive, I think. Gon asks, do you all have any thoughts on the use of William Z. Foster's organizing methods in the steel industry by the Amazon labor union in the US?
No.
Okay. Yeah.
No.
I was going to ask, building off of that, like, do you feel like, you know, the win with the Amazon labor union is sort of a vindication of your position of like independent working class organizing? And
I personally don't know enough about it.
Yeah, to be honest, like, I did say actually before this meeting, oh God, we should like have like be a bit up to speed about what happened there. It's on our to-do list to read, but like, you know, I guess so.
I mean, we just like met comrade from Germany who's part of these international Amazon meetings, and there's more stuff happening in terms of coordination between, let's say, Polish, Italian, French, German workers at least, and they always have like people kind of phoning in from the US. So there is like a kind of effort, at least, to look at the, you know, international dynamics. But for me, the question is also like, you know, logistics on one hand, yeah, these are big workplaces, and you know, it's a massive industry and makes a lot of money, that's for sure, but it's not like a factory in the sense of, you know, people really see that by cooperating, working together, bringing knowledge, creativity into it, we actually produce a different thing. You know, it's like, you know, you see that, you know, by everyone, you know, a lot of people working, that things get circulated. But I think the fact that we haven't seen any kind of further political developments coming out of that, like something like the political committees in, you know, in Italy, or some kind of, yeah, a bit more, I don't know, yeah, political thought has something to do with the fact that logistics is circulation rather than, creating and changing nature, and having a thought that we could also change society. We can interrupt the flow of goods, but like if you don't really produce them, it's like your struggle will be rather like, you could say to a certain degree opportunistic and say, okay, we can stop this producing here and we can get a good cash, but it's not really maybe that's too reductionist to say like, oh, only out of the productive part of the working class higher level of consciousness can arise, but I think there is a bit of a link. But yeah,
I mean, we were kind of having this discussion about like, objective and subjective conditions, and like how, at what kind of level do both of those things need to happen in, or level do they need to reach in order for like something to happen? And like, as you said, the objective conditions might push people like immiseration or whatever into like taking action, but like if subjectively your work is still quite is not engendering a kind of like collective brain or collective militancy or collective vision, then where does that leave us?
So yeah, for us at the moment, we think like a priority would be to discuss again, and we haven't really done that since the 70s, the relation between intellectual and manual labor and how it is currently stratified and organized. What is an engineer nowadays? Is it more proletarian or not? Is the knowledge that an engineer had maybe in the 60s, how is that compared to today? What does it mean if you've got like, let's say, intellectual labor in Silicon Valley that is used productively in China? It's like, I think the crux is, the working class has got enough reasons to fight. They've got like, probably enough experience, but like if this kind of division is not overcome in a movement, and it can't be done just artificially through just some box organization, it has to be really undone. Then the idea of creating a different society is completely just abstract. So for us, that's why we're interested in these kind of little signs amongst the tech workers and amongst so-called more intellectual workers, how much that is coming from a purely political, oh, we want to do something for climate change, or how much they also relate to, let's say, the manual workers. So yeah, I think that's for us is something where conceptually we want to re-understand this division of labor, and also empirically. So yeah, I think we have to formulate that as a kind of wider proposal to comrades in other industries and countries. But I think that's a crux.
Yeah, I mean, off of that, I actually was going to ask how influential the Lucas plan is for you all. Like, do you see that as a path forward, as overcoming that division between mental and manual labor? Like maybe forming committees between technicians and manual laborers who run the factories or whatever, and like re-envisioning, if like we're trying to think about this idea of a revolutionary transition, part of that is like redesigning our jobs that are actually based off of use value rather than extraction of surplus value and all that stuff. So yeah, I don't was the Lucas plan ever in your mind when you're thinking about this sort of a thing?
Your granddad worked at Lucas, you have to tell him.
Yeah. He didn't work at because the Lucas Plan site wasn't the one that he worked at. But anyway, he was like a manual worker, he didn't speak any English. And so there was absolutely no relationship between the kind of engineers or whatever who came up with the Lucas Plan and workers like him. Like a lot of what the Lucas Plan, I mean, it was good, but I mean, it was very much directed towards like the state. I mean, it was a conversation between the state and these like intellectual workers, and so somehow it kind of had the potential, I guess, to like break down the divisions within the workforce. But I think in reality, it didn't.
Yeah, and they also had the hope that by becoming the cleverer engineers and also having an economic plan, like, financing it all, that would be strength enough to counter the attack from the company. So, but it wasn't. So in the end, they were not really prepared for the factory closures and all that. They had no plan. At the same time, they would have had to develop like something like self-defense, which would include like, Kieran's granddad, or some manual workers. And at the same time, maybe also develop, the creative part. But they really thought our main ally is not the manual worker. Our main ally are these enlightened guys, like who was it? Not Ken Livingstone. It was
Tony Benn.
Yeah, Tony Benn. These labor left. If we get in with them, maybe they can, make a little deal, and we can, be a successful company. I think.
I mean, still kind of the idea of like reimagining, like repurposing your workplace for something is like great, and that's kind of what we would hope for, like our work around Heathrow Airport. Ultimately, like, at some point, this is just going to be untenable to have these millions of planes flying, every day. Like, what would we use it for? Like, what is the workers' role in those airports? Like, thinking about how to like do something else. I mean, that just seems so far away. From
you think there's a propagandistic like value in that, like trying to at least get workers to imagine this, like I think about this all the time at my job. Like, I work retail, and the whole premise is just constantly trying to get people to consume and buy more than what they need, right? And so you see like they put up sales signs to entice people to buy more than what they would want. And it's always about that idea versus like, well, how would we restructure this based on what would actually be necessary? Like, is this a necessary job? I think it is in some ways, but then in others, it's like it feels totally pointless and wasteful.
Yeah, no, completely. And it's somehow tragic that it's mainly the environmental kind of climate change kind of wing that is very detached from the class, but they really think about like, how is agriculture organized nowadays? How is energy? What kind of alternative energy models could there be? Alternative agriculture. So, but like still quite detached from any workers' content. So they're not really, they can't really relate to the wealth that's already there from workers, and also the critique. They don't know what alienated labor is. They just kind of imagine, oh, we just change the energy a bit, or make it a bit greener. But at the same time, they do the actual work of empirically researching how we produce this world and how we could produce a different way, but like without the worker content. And everyone else is just like trying to reduce the worker question to like, wages or labor time, conditions. So that's, I think, would be for us a challenge as a kind of organization to see how workers develop productive knowledge nowadays. It can be partly contained in the cooperative movement. Some of our comrades are quite like in workers cooperatives, not like as the social alternative, more like in certain industries that makes sense. But like these are kind of things that in a movement can become of importance once they they break out of their economic shell and become part of a movement where workers actually have learned a lot. How do you kind of mobilize all that?
There's this good line, I can't remember where I heard it from, but the idea like before you can have revolution, you have to first make public opinion for it, right? And so I think that just speaks to how important propaganda is and all this on our end, and putting forward that vision. And just locally thinking about, we have this crucial munitions plant where we live, that it's like the only site in the country that actually produces nitrocellulose, which is utilized for all ammunition and missiles and whatnot. It's managed by BAE Systems, actually. And it's been in operation since World War II, but it's like this thing is playing a crucial role in providing like the imperialist supply chain for the US and then whoever they sell abroad, plenty of terrible states like Saudi Arabia and whatever. And just thinking like, well, how can we reconfigure this site because it is a large employer in the area. It does have union representation, but they have totally bought into this, like, this is a patriotic duty of us to produce these munitions, and any sort of idea of messing with that is terroristic and should be reported. So it's like trying to struggle with that. Like, what are the civilian uses of this chemical that they're producing there, and rather than like just going along with it to produce, even though like we know there are like safety issues there, and we could try to struggle around just the bread and butter issues, but then neglect the larger political issue of it, as like this crucial production site in the imperialist supply chain. And then on top of that, the beginning of any sort of political critique of it is coming from the environmentalists. But the thing is they're only concerned about how it potentially locally is harming the population, not about like how many people are actually, countless people being harmed from the munitions produced there, in terms of waging imperialist war. So just thinking about that idea of like, how can we win over workers? Because we don't want them unemployed, right? But then at the same time, we don't want this operation to continue because of how much harm it's causing the world. And
yeah. No, we have to find examples like in Australia, the building workers, construction workers union, I think in the 70s, 80s, they said, okay, as a union, certain greenfield projects, which are just like, I don't know, some luxury flats on some, fairly important, greenlands, we just oppose them as a union. Or I think the chemical workers in Italy, Porto Marghera, they were the first to really analyze the cancerous quality of what they were producing, and they say like, okay, as long as the capitalist doesn't invest in better filter system and things, we really reduce production here. So I think there are examples where workers who are dependent on these jobs, with their collective strengths, also develop like a critique of their, of their work, because they were also the first who got harmed. I think that might be the case there as well. I mean, probably, maybe cancer rate amongst the workers who work in that plant in your area, there might be immediate effects on the workers as well. But that's why, like, in a hospital as well, we try to somehow think, how can workers and patients develop some new idea about like what is health, because we see like how class specific a lot of ailments are. You see that the way that the hospital itself is organized causes so much stress for the workers in the hospital that you become a patient in the long run. It's just like, at the same time, a lot of the knowledge is really separate. I mean, you have to go to medical school, they really keep certain things away from both the patients and like lower skilled workers. So how can we relate to doctors, in a class sense? Are they actually workers? They definitely have knowledge that we all need, but like, how, at the same time, that's what makes them privileged. So it's like all these things, we have to tease out more, and we haven't done that for a
while. What would you update about your book from when it first published to where we're at now?
Well, we mentioned a bit with the fire and rehire struggles. What else?
So now I guess we would kind of do a bit of a summary of where we think we're at now post pandemic, and maybe kind of drilling down a bit into these objective and subjective conditions and what potential they have. I mean, we would still kind of push our project as a way of like finding this stuff out, and like, giving us a kind of political framework for thinking about what we're doing. And sorry, there's really grammars just rounding.
It's okay. Yeah, I mean,
quite tired.
we we mainly come across like individuals. Very few people are organized like you guys and actually like, you know, have some collective practice. A lot of people that, you know, gave us feedbacks from, you know, to the books were like individuals, which is great. But like, you know, what we need is really like people who have some collective practice, some collective debate, and then enter some, you know, like a, you know, a discussion.
And just kind of say like this, to write the books was not a plan in the beginning, and like we just kind of thought about that 6 years in, like, oh, we've actually got quite a lot of material, like let's write it down. But the idea was for it to be used as a tool to like get in touch with like groups like you, and just to kind of build up a bit more of a like network of groups doing similar things, to like push that debate and also feel not quite so alone. But yeah, as Marcus said, like it hasn't really, yeah, there's a lot of kind of isolated individuals out there, and it's very kind of difficult to then build something on that, you know?
Yeah, or if you have got, like in Italy, for example, you've got quite a few groups that are active, but they're so, you know, they're so active that, you know, they don't have the time, or they don't see much need for international organization, because, you know, their struggle is going on, you know, they have a movement, you know, permanently. So like, why should they talk to some kind of little minoritarian group in the UK? They, you know, they're in it. So, you know, we had like at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a website project called Fever Struggle, and quite a few comrades were involved in that. And it was like at the beginning it worked because each region wanted to know like what's happening, you know, in Brazil, what's happening in Europe. But at some point, I think that was not enough cohesion, and the website disbanded again. So, but I think it would be good to have something like that now with the war, like, you know, people who are not just like interested in posting like their programmatic positions on the war, but really like, okay, from a general point of working class point of view and opposition to the war, what are like investigation into, you know, now like the impact on, you know, the global south in terms of food prices, the little resistance that we know is happening in Russia. We've got like more contacts in Latin America than in Russia. That's kind of weird, but that's the case. So how can we really get to know some worker comrades in Russia? These kind of things, it's just like, you know, that I think somehow the book and the little context that we got opened that up, but yeah, it's still very sketchy. And I think we can't just, you know, call for the next international and then it will happen. It has to be around very clear, I would say, lines of investigation, of political debate. And for us, one would be, yeah, for example, the question of nowadays, you know, intellectual manual labor, how is that configured? What does it mean for transition? That's a debate that we would like to have. One definitely about the war, but yeah, it's the framework, you know, in what kind of framework do we do that nowadays? Like websites like Libcom they have, you know, they're useful to a certain extent, but they're also degenerated. There is no international forum really that we are aware of where that kind of exchange can happen. But maybe you guys are aware of one. I don't know.
No, I think you guys there have a better pulse than we do, and I think it's sorely needed. You know, worker internationalism and a worker international organization would be very useful. That isn't mediated through either like a social democratic front or the UN or, you know, whatever. I know you guys have been at it for a while, and you're tired and exhausted. I fielded one last question here. Gon wants to know, how do individual workers make the transformation into a collective labor project?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tricky one. I mean, you kind of, unless you're like massively motivated, like Duracell Bunny, then it's quite, or you've got like co-workers who kind of want to do something with you, then it's just,
yeah. But like at the same time, workers do it every day, like in some form or the other. Like people like, you know, at work, you know, from resisting like your whatever, the forklift drivers not accepting like shitty health and safety, you come to like 4 or 5 people agreeing something and opposing a manager, or like us healthcare assistants saying like we don't work for the minimum wage and don't get training, and management offered us 250 quid 250 pound Amazon vouchers, and we said fuck off.
I read the question more like, is it about people that like contact us as like individual worker comrades, I guess, but maybe I understood it wrong, because that's kind of what we've been grappling with. It's like, you maintain contact with like individual workers who are like interested, who like call themselves Marxists, communists, whatever, then it's, I think you can have a kind of productive relationship, find out like what work they're doing, how, like there's a few people like that farmer in Germany,
like,
and he's like, he read the book, and so it's very interesting from his perspective to read it like from a kind of agricultural worker, like how his kind of situation was, and we kind of still, he's come to some reading groups or whatever, so you kind of find out a bit, and then you kind of have these contacts still. But I mean, to make that into a kind of bigger or more kind of solid group, it hasn't happened, does it?
No, but I think it would happen through like a common analysis. If one of our main thing trying to understand is like how, for example, in a movement in Sudan, it has got like, people are not afraid to oppose like a military dictatorship, but if you depend 60% on wheat import, or like all your grazing land is bought by Saudi Arabia to put the cows for the meat for Saudi Arabia on top of it, it's just like, how far can a movement go that is so immediately dependent on international trade? And there you discuss about agriculture, and then this geezer from this individual contact might have something to say. So I think it
might have something to say, but is that a collective labor project?
I think that's the basis of it.
I mean, it depends on what your definition is on that, but I would say like something kind of building a workplace group or something like that is like a collective labor project. And I think you need at least 2 people who've got a bit of get up and go, and you can manage to do quite a lot, but it's quite like intensive and maybe a bit long term.
It's also fun though.
Yes, very fun.
I've been at it 5 years, toiling away at my store and
you
trying
can
to
see our haggard faces.
it's fun, sure, yeah. But yeah, well, I appreciate you all taking the time to do this. I don't want to keep you any longer. I know you're exhausted. Do you have any final comments, thoughts?
No, but yeah, I mean, we should continue the discussion. That would be great.
I mean, we're kind of finding our feet in a different city, and we started working at this hospital, and like, so at the moment we're kind of thinking a bit about like the hospital and the airport, of these kind of sites where a lot of issues of the day are converging, like climate change and immigration controls, and like like low paid work, and like fire and rehire, and these are kind of like microcosms of like stuff that's important, things that are happening, and like how are we relating to that? So that's kind of what we're doing at the moment, and we'll kind of write some stuff, I guess, if anyone is like a healthcare worker or is into an aviation worker or knows people or whatever, then we would be happy to talk.
Yeah, that's true.
Great. Yeah, folks, check out their website, angryworkers.org. If you're in Virginia and you want to write up some content for our website, you're more than welcome to. It's thevirginiaworker.com. And yeah, our next event, I think, is going to be on May 24th with a Marxist archaeologist about Maroon peoples who set up their colonies out in the swamps away from like colonial Virginia and its slave system. So thanks again, y'all. We'll be in touch for sure. And, solidarity.
Thanks for
Right.
having us.
Right on.